It's a share screen.
Okay, got it. Welcome everyone to our webinar on is it possible to ban nuclear weapons? And maybe we should say, since there now is a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, is it possible to effectively ban nuclear weapons? Our first speaker is going to be Bob Farquhar, who has written a very fun and interesting book. Well, I shouldn't call it fun, but it's written as kind of a comic book in a way called Duck Cover.
It's a pictorial history. There's a lot of books written about nuclear weapons, but they're at the college PhD level. And I read somewhere once Admiral Miller had written a book about the stockpile. And he did one entire chapter devoted to educating the public. And he said he learned in graduate school that if you were going to communicate with your average American, you needed to write at the 6th grade level. And so I developed a book using pictures and graphics and a caveman named Ralph that makes it very easy to understand. So
go right ahead, Bob, and tell us, begin your presentation.
All right, well, let's see if I can get the first screenshot up there that I had. Click on that. And I'm screen sharing, but I don't see what I'm sharing.
Just open your file explorer,
Oh, okay.
then click on your slides. There we go.
All right. This is kind of a joke, but this, talking about the stockpile, the general thought process has been through the years that the more bombs you have, the more deterrence you have. Your deterrence is more effective, but that's not always the case. And let's see if I can. This is a chart showing from 1942 on till 2009. It's behind date. But this is the growth and decline of nuclear stockpiles between the US and Russia. And if you can see that the US kind of peaked out around 1967. And at that point, we had about 32,000 warheads of 20-some varieties, cannon shells, drop bombs, thermonuclear bombs, backpack bombs that you could take, torpedoes, all sorts of things. But the bad thing was that we achieved that many nuclear weapons, but the good thing is that we have gone down. And if I wanted to consider this, and you saw the numbers for the US and Russia. These are the numbers for everybody else, part of the P5. And you can see their growth, and then as they are tapering off in the number of warheads that they have. This comes out of what's called the Nuclear Posture Review, which just came out 2 weeks ago. It's a paper that the White House has to do within a year of them coming into office. And what it does, it declares or states our policy towards nuclear weapons, what we're going to deploy. There's classified version that Congress got this year in March, but they didn't release the unclassified version that I got 2 weeks ago, which lays out what the plan is for the security of our nation. But this is our declaratory policy, that as long as nuclear weapons exist, we're going to have them, and we might use them. And here's one chart showing the global warheads, who's got them, and this is fairly current. Chris Christensen used to be with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He works on this, and that's where I get most of my, what I consider valid numbers, come from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists here in Chicago. And Chris Christensen comes up with these yearly estimates of who has what and what for. So here's what we got in the in the world. All right, let me close that out if I can. How do I close it? Click. Oh, stop share. There we go. Anyway, the United States, we've come down. We currently have, well, let's see, this is Russia. United States, we currently have 5,428 nuclear warheads. And this New START treaty limits the US and Russia to 5,000 or 1,550 nuclear warheads. That's fortunately one treaty that we do have with Russia. But out of those 5,400 warheads, the United States, we've got about 1,700 deployed. Then we have about 2,000 that we consider to be the hedge stockpile, that we might need them just in case. I don't know why you would need more nuclear weapons, but that we keep them as a hedge. And then finally, there's about 2,000 that are awaiting dismantlement. And dismantlement is, they don't make a lot of money dismantling at Pantex, where they assemble nuclear weapons. They make more money rebuilding them or building new ones. And it's the same in Russia. They have some certain number of launchers. They have a certain number of warheads, 1,550, and the rest are stored away someplace for a rainy day or to be gotten rid of. Let's see. Click on screen and then okay. What we have left after we got rid of all those 70,000 warheads that we had, we are left with the B-61. It's a cute little thing, weighs 700 pounds. It costs its weight in gold. It weighs 700 pounds. So roughly $20 million each. The B-83 is below that. There's a 1.2 megaton bomb. We are going to be getting rid of that under the NPR that just came out. They call for the B-83 to be retired. They do not need a bomb with that capability. If you think back to the Cold War, we had bombs that would do 9 megatons, 20 megatons. We don't need them that big anymore because things have become more accurate. Oops, that guy again. We have the W80, which is in storage right now. It's a variable yield warhead. And warhead, they don't like to call these things warheads. The people that make them, they refer to them as a device. So that makes it a lot easier, I guess, to stomach. We have the W-78 on top of Minuteman missiles. The W-87 used to go on top of the Peacekeeper. And that would be the Peacekeeper carried 10 reentry vehicles with the yield of 300 kilotons each. And then the Navy, they've got the W-76 and the W-88 that they use for their submarine launched missiles. I think that's about all the fun pictures that I have. So that's basically, our stockpile. And there's no need for that many. Most people agree, except the people that make them or are in the business. I don't know if that goes to answer the particular question at the beginning. Can we get rid of the damn things? We've gotten rid of a lot of them already. We're on a roll, but it's a matter of keeping engaged with the different players. And in the NPR this year, China, North Korea, Iran, who else? Let's see, there are 4 bad guys. Anybody know the bad guy? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Those are our concerns. And so we're going to continue having nuclear weapons, whether we like it or not. The other question I had tonight was why no first use, why there is no policy saying that we will never use a nuclear weapon first. It's a nice idea to have, but if you tell somebody I'm only going to use these for if you attack me, then he says, well, maybe I can attack this guy over here, like these schmucks down in the Ukraine. And what can he do about it? China and India currently have a no first use policy. Russia had one up until 1992 when the Soviet Union split up and they brought their missiles back from the Ukraine. The Ukrainians should have kept the damn things, but they didn't want them either. Obama and Bush both subscribed to a statement of for first use. We will not use them first. And they call it also the sole purpose. That's another policy that the wonks up in Washington are dealing with, trying to come up with something that says the sole purpose of a nuclear weapon is, but that ties your hands. So, first use, yes, nobody should use them first. We say that we will retaliate but we have all the saber rattling we've had, Trump and other presidents that use threats, the nuclear weapons as a threat, just like Putin is doing with Ukraine. That, like I say, the nuclear posture review is out. It's a big change from the Trump administration. Trump did some things and asked for weapon systems that aren't going to happen. The new NPR kills the B-83. Trump had wanted a submarine launch cruise missile, and the powers that be have killed that program too. The pushes for democracy are diplomacy, and yes, it would be nice to have a no first use policy, but I don't see that that's going to happen in quite a while. How much time do I have? Somebody got the stopwatch on me?
Don?
You're about done.
Okay, well, let me rush through this then, or I can come back to it later. You talked about the modernization of the triad, submarines, bombers, missiles. The U.S. intends to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize submarines, bombers, and missiles at great expense. And this stems back to the New START Treaty, which is a treaty that I worked on, pushing it through. But the Republicans said that if you want us to agree to the New START Treaty, you have to promise to expend so much money on missiles, bombs, and submarines. And Obama did that. And so now it's time to pay the piper. So we're looking at new bombers at a cost of $1 billion each. Submarines, $9.5 billion. New missiles in the ground, let's see, $95 billion for 400 missiles, doesn't include spares. And so your tax dollars at work. And then the last thing you asked about was tactical warheads, why there's no limits on them. Actually, there are limits. It's included with New START, but they're counted differently. But yes, Russia has about 1,600 tactical, meaning short range, a very short range missile for anti-submarine stuff or blowing somebody up on the ground. We have 260 B-61 bombs, and 100 of those are stored in Europe at various locations, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Turkey. And but the problem with a tactical nuke, it's the same with Trump. Trump wanted to put a usable, as it was termed, usable low yield warhead on the Trident submarine. And this is a warhead that they did it. They cut it back from 90 kilotons to now it puts out maybe 5 to 7 kilotons, very small device, you know, half the size that took out Hiroshima. But it muddies the line when you start talking about usable and low yield, because there's a temptation to look at it that it's nothing more than another bomb. And so there is a tendency by the war fighter, whoever they may be, to opt to use a low yield nuke for some purpose or another. And it opens up the can of worms that we don't want to open. And that's about it then. I hope I'm in my time.
Thank you, Bob. That was a very a frightening and grim picture of.
Well, but you know, there is positive things. I read the NPR this week and read the analysis of it, and it's actually a very good thing, but this all takes time. My grandchildren will still be dealing with nuclear weapons when I'm gone. So,
Okay,
all right, I'll shut up.
our next speaker is Edward Horgan, who's coming to us from Ireland, from Dublin. And Edward is part of a peace and justice group over there working to deal with all of these frightening threats to our peace. Edward, please take it away.
Edward, you're on mute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good evening, everybody. In 15 minutes, how can I save the world? Well, let's try anyway. I'll begin by saying that if we do not destroy or eliminate nuclear weapons will destroy us and all of humanity and most other living creatures on our planet. In matters of promoting international peace as individuals and groups like your Fox Valley Citizens Peace and Justice Group, we can never fully evaluate how successful our efforts are going to be. Yet we can be 100% sure if we do nothing, we will achieve nothing. And my experience is that individuals and groups like ours can achieve quite a bit. Let us remember that peace without justice is just a temporary ceasefire. Many people, including probably several of those involved in negotiating the treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons, were probably surprised at how successful they had been so far. We do need a healthy skepticism about commitments by national and international leaders to do the right thing. So we must also find ways of holding our leaders to account. At the COP22 at the moment in Egypt right now, we're hearing lots of impressive promises, but these same leaders have been failing miserably to live up to past promises on climate change. The same applies to nuclear weapons. People will say, we won't use them first, but I think the reality is, if you have them to use them. Some of what I will be saying will be negative and highlights the difficulties of what we're up against. It's important to recognize these difficulties so we can find ways to overcome them. And it's vital to keep on trying to do what we can to promote international peace and justice. On a note of optimism, I noticed in the past 48 hours, there are indications that some negotiations for peace in Ukraine are being planned for the next G7 meeting. It will be too late for the tens of thousands who've already been killed in this war in Ukraine since 2014, but it may be a ray of hope for those who will be killed if war continues. I come from Ireland, which is supposed to be a neutral state, but Ireland is being pressurized to abandon its neutrality by the US and its NATO allies. As a small country with a very small army, Ireland has very little military power that would be of any use to anybody in a war. So why are we being pressurized to abandon our neutrality? Sweden and Finland have already abandoned their neutrality in the past few months. In my view, NATO, led by the US, has become one of the greatest threats to global peace, even though NATO claims to be a purely defensive and law-abiding organization. The reality is that since the end of the Cold War, when NATO should have been disbanded, it needed a reason for its continued existence. it needed to create a new or imagined enemies to replace the old Soviet, communist Soviet Union. And the real ongoing purpose of NATO may well be to help its member states to control and gain access to an unjustified proportion of the world's very limited resources at the expense of the rest of humanity. Instead of obeying and supporting international laws and the UN Charter, NATO launched a series of illegal wars against Serbia in 1999, Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, and has been supporting destructive wars in Syria, Yemen, and various African countries and elsewhere, and has been seriously threatening Russia by expanding up to Russia's borders, and is now beginning to threaten even China. The US represents just over 4% of the world's population, and all the NATO countries combined less than 10% of the world's population, whereas China on its own represents 18% of the population of the world, and all of Asia 58%. When you include Africa, Latin America, you have 90% of humanity. So here we have 10% of humanity attempting to dominate, in my view, 90%. If you believe as I do that every individual is equally important from a resource point of view and a human rights point of view, and that the right to life, the right not to be unlawfully killed, is the most important of all human rights, then one must conclude that NATO, led by the US, has become the equivalent of a criminal protection racket. In my view, a Chinese person or a person from Africa or South America is just as important as you or I. Why is this relevant to nuclear weapons and the real risks of nuclear war? Organizations like CIPRI tell us that the total number of nuclear weapons, as Bob has told us, by the 9 states is somewhere in the region of 12,000 nuclear bombs. The real numbers may well be higher. I'm a bit skeptical as a military person or a former military person. Security people and military don't always tell the truth, as we sometimes suspect. The real numbers may be higher, and there are plans to increase the numbers over the next decade. There have been several international treaties to reduce the numbers of nuclear weapons or to get rid of them all, sir. 2 of them, I think, are the more important ones. They include the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, signed in July 1968. Ireland played a major role in negotiating for this treaty. 190 countries have signed up for this treaty, but not all of them have complied with its provisions. 4 of the present nuclear countries have not signed this treaty: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. And it's likely that several of the countries who have signed the treaty helped India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea to acquire those weapons. So those countries who helped them were clearly in breach of that treaty. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was signed in 2017 and makes it illegal to under international law, to develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire, stockpile, transfer, or use or threaten nuclear weapons. It also makes it illegal to assist anyone to engage in these activities. The problem is that none of these 9 countries that have nuclear weapons have signed this treaty. It is also a reality that the US has given nuclear weapons to several other countries, as Bob mentioned, like Germany, Belgium, and there are some stored in Turkey at present. And these can be used with the permission of the US in the event of a war. So the number of countries, in fact, is in reality in excess of 9. There is another problem also. 5 of the nuclear armed states, US, Russia, China, UK, and France, are also permanent members of the UN Security Council. In theory, at least, they are responsible for upholding the UN Charter and international laws and preventing or even punishing other states who breach the UN Charter. When these 5 countries, primarily led by the US, UK, and Soviet Union, drafted the UN Charter, they placed themselves above and beyond the UN and above and beyond international laws, giving themselves a veto over all actions of the UN Security Council. the power of veto is so worded that any one of the 5 permanent members can veto all the decisions of the UN Security Council, so that the UN Security Council, and therefore the UN itself as a whole, cannot punish any of the 5 permanent members. To make matters even worse, the power of veto applies to any attempt to change the power of veto. So there is no chance that the abuses of power of veto can ever be held to account by the UN. So if any of these 5 powers decides to use nuclear weapons, as the US did in 1945, there is no present organization in the world that can censor or prevent or punish them. We hear a lot at present about Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine, and it's certain that Russia has committed some war crimes. It's likely also that Ukrainian forces have also committed war crimes. War itself is arguably a war crime in this 21st century. Russia knows that it cannot be held to account for these war crimes, just as the US cannot be held to account for war crimes committed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. The mice will be punished, and while the lions will run free. There are several other treaties with regard to nuclear weapons. I won't list them all. I'll just mention 2, in fact, that I found at least interesting, if not a little bit mind-boggling. There's one particular nuclear treaty. It's called the Peaceful Nuclear Explosion Treaty, as if any treaty involving nuclear weapons could be remotely peaceful. It was made between the US and the former Soviet Union, and it talks about civilian use of nuclear weapons or nuclear bombs. For example, for mining or quarrying or creating dams. Both treaties came into force as recently as 1990. You might compare, if you like, if you wanted to build a large swimming pool in your back garden, instead of bringing in a big bulldozer to dig a big hole, you might bring in a small nuclear bomb and blow a big hole in your back garden. Now, some of your neighbours in Fox Valley might object to that and might be a little bit concerned, particularly if your neighbours are a bit unreasonable. But you can see that treaties like this are slightly ridiculous and unworkable, basically. There's another treaty called the Seabed Treaty. This agreement entered into force in 1972, and with the purpose of forbidding the siting of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction on the seabed or ocean floor over 12 miles away from any coast. It means you're not allowed to plant them out in the deep sea. But that seems to imply to me that you are allowed to plant nuclear bombs, for example, within 5 miles of New York or within 8 miles of London or St. Petersburg. So we need a sense of humor, I suppose, even discussing matters like this, to try and cope with the problems that exist with nuclear weapons or any weapons of mass destruction. There is provision in most of these treaties for the so-called peaceful use of nuclear energy and nuclear technology, which ignores the inherent risks that go with nuclear power. Nuclear accidents do happen. 3 Mile Island in the US, Sellafield in the UK, much too close to Ireland, Chernobyl in the Ukraine, Fukushima, just to mention a few. The greatest difficulty in recent times is the gross breaches of international laws being perpetrated, especially by at least 4 of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, including the US, UK, France, and Russia. I leave out China to some extent, because while there are serious human rights abuses in China, within China itself, and these should be condemned, such internal matters don't fall within the scope of the UN Charter. Clearly they should, but that's the reality. The UN Charter itself is a very flawed document in my view. It seems to me that it was designed almost to fail. With the exception of Tibet, China has never invaded anybody or occupied a foreign country over the past 3,000 years or so. This contrasts with the United States and most European countries who have a history of slavery, colonialism, exploitation, and very serious crimes against humanity, including genocide. The UN Charter, Article 74 in particular, talks about the power of the UN Security Council and the responsibilities placed on it. And it says, in discharging these duties, the Security Council shall act in accordance with the purposes and principle of the United Nations. Clearly, that is not happening at all when it comes to making war. And Article 27 also is the article of the UN Charter, in which the power of veto, it reads almost quite innocently, decisions of the UN Security Council on all other matters shall be made on an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurrent votes of the permanent members. That means that each of the 5 permanent members must agree. If any one of them disagrees, they have a veto, and they can prevent the UN from doing what the UN should be doing. The US has never been held to account by the UN or by anyone else for the atomic bombing of Japan in 1945. Those in favor of nuclear weapons argue that the so-called MAD, nuclear deterrent, mutually assured destruction, has actually prevented World War III. We may well be in the early stages of World War III if the war in Ukraine deteriorates. The reality is the existence of nuclear weapons has terrorized humanity since 1945. Its proponents tell us that the prospect of nuclear war is so unthinkable that nuclear weapons will never be used, and also that the possession of nuclear weapons means that wars between major powers are most unlikely. My own firm view, partly based on my military experience, is as follows. If you have the most advanced and most terrifying weapons, then you have them to use them in certain circumstances. I also believe it's a fallacy that all the countries who have nuclear weapons, that they have no intention of a first use policy. In all such cases, it's my belief and fear that in certain circumstances, each of these countries, including the US, will resort to using them on a first use preventive or preemptive basis. The US has already done so against Japan, and the widespread use of depleted uranium munitions also demonstrates the irresponsibility of these powers. Dangers of accidents and deliberate attacks on nuclear power stations are also very serious problems that are not getting enough attention. We should be questioning the real dangers of nuclear power itself and nuclear power stations, and pushing for the eventual abandonment of nuclear energy as well as nuclear weapons. Ireland in particular is vulnerable to damaged by nuclear power station accidents. Most of the British nuclear power stations, or many of them, are located on the west coast of Britain, far away from the populated areas of England, but much too close to Ireland. The reality with nuclear weapons is, if a country like the US or Russia or India or Pakistan are in a major crisis or in war with each other, in which there's a risk of nuclear weapons being used, and there always will be, then it's too late to use them only in retaliation after your country has been hit by the enemy's nuclear weapons. This is why the possession of nuclear weapons by any country is unacceptable. The possession of nuclear weapons is a war crime waiting to happen. Of course, the reality also is that the victors in major wars are never held to account for their war crimes. Russia also knows that this in the case of its war in Ukraine. It cannot afford to lose the war in Ukraine, so it will do all in its power to win this war, regardless of the costs in Ukrainian and Russian lives. The likelihood or risk of Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine is relatively low, except that there's always a serious risk of weapons being used by mistake or stupidity.
Edward, could you wrap it up?
Yep. The US and NATO and Russia are playing a very dangerous game of Russian roulette, except that this game is not being played with an old-fashioned revolver. The Russian roulette game is being played with thousands of nuclear bombs. Our Irish government is also playing a type of Russian roulette with Irish neutrality. Since 2001, it has been allowing US military forces on their way to wars in the Middle East to transit for Shannon Airport. And to make matters worse, the government has taken a very one-sided approach with the war in Ukraine. Ireland has been a member of the UN Security Council almost for the last 2 years, when it should have been using all its ability to make peace in Ukraine. Yet we have sided with Ukraine for no good reason, and when we should have been negotiating peace. Nuclear war is not the only danger facing humanity at present. While nuclear threat is a possibility, climate change is also a reality, and the damage being done already by climate change is causing huge problems with tens of thousands of deaths. War and militarism are major contributors to climate change. And the same applies with regard to aircraft. Yes, Ireland claims that it is fully compliant with the non-use of nuclear weapons. Yet on a regular basis, US and other NATO ships are pulling into Irish harbours and quite likely carrying nuclear weapons. There's a very close kinship between the people of Ireland and the people of the United States. So when I criticise the United States, it's the United States government I'm criticising and not the people of the United States. My own family is typical of a West of Ireland family. My mother immigrated to Boston and worked there for 10 years before coming back to Ireland. My grandmother on my father's side, called Ellen Lynch, immigrated to Chicago for 5 years, and 3 of my siblings immigrated to the US. So I'm not criticizing the American people, it's the government. And I also, and it's very important that you would hold your government to account, and I will do my best to hold our Irish government to account also. And again, peace and justice for all of humanity has never been more important than it is today. And yes, it is possible to ban nuclear weapons, but it's definitely not going to be easy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you. All right. Forgive me, I'm not doing formal introductions because this feels like a very informal group. So I'd like to turn things over to Kathy Kelly right away. Most of you know her or know of her. Kathy Kelly, take it away.
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. And I feel as though I'll be pleased if I can mainly echo what we've already heard. I think maybe one way to frame the questions is to ask ourselves, okay, what are the threats that we really do face? And any rational estimation of the real threats we face, I believe, would have to first point out climate catastrophe, and then pandemics and nuclear weapon proliferation. But militarized security doesn't protect us from those threats at all. In fact, a militarized approach to security will always undermine our capacities to actually deal with climate catastrophe and nuclear weapon proliferation and pandemics. And so how can we defend ourselves? It seems clear that we need to become people who would pool our resources deliberately so that we could cope with climate catastrophe. We need massive collaboration amongst scientists, and we need to be developing a much, much better capacity to cope with the consequences of our failures to deal with climate catastrophe, particularly being able to welcome large numbers of refugees. So I think that we've just heard from 2 realists. Edward and Bob are the realists. They're not crazed idealists. They're pointing out the real situation we face. And I think that it's very important that we also reckon with the numbers of people globally who might agree with these realists. Thank you, Edward, for pointing out the percentages of the numbers of people on our planet who live in the nuclear weapon possessing states as opposed to all of those other states. So I want to share a screen, and I want to show you a few other realists whom I'm very grateful for. And I wonder, are you able to see my screen?
Yes,
Okay, so the first slide that I wanted to share with you, you're going to have to squint a bit at this, but I think these children are realists. And in the middle of the bottom section of that photo, you see little Sakina. She's an Afghan child laborer, and she's carrying a yellow-handled hammer. And she and her friends had gathered together as many toy guns as they could. And she's about to beat that plastic toy gun into pieces. And then they're going to bury all of the destroyed plastic toy guns. And then they planted a tree on top of that. And I see these kids doing their own kind of plowshares action as realists who are very much in tune with what's put in such a dignified fashion right across from the United Nations, to quote from the book of Isaiah, "When shall come the day when they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they continue to learn the ways of war any longer." So this is a photo of the unexploded ordnance in Afghanistan. Those kids wanted to bury the guns, but actually buried all across Afghanistan. Over 40 years of war, 20 of them war waged by the United States, is the unexploded ordnance, the criminal presence of cluster bombs, landmines, missiles, and they continue to kill people in Afghanistan today. And yet those youngsters, some of them called me after the Uvalde massacre to ask how could they express their condolence to families in the United States. So I want to assert that I would imagine most scientists pursue their scientific research based on the projects that are put in front of them. And if you were to put in front of scientists projects that would enable us to much better cope with climate catastrophe, or deal with refugee populations, or solve our very immediate problems that cause our humane needs to go unmet, or planetary needs to go unmet, people would pursue that. But quite often, the kinds of projects that are placed in front of scientists are ones that are devised by Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and other military industrial corporation groups. And it doesn't help us to have treaties that just say, let's limit how many of those weapons we make. We need a treaty like the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which stigmatizes the creation of nuclear weapons, names it as a criminal act to produce or develop or store or sell these weapons, and makes it criminal, illegal for any country that ratifies that treaty to be engaged in any part of nuclear weapon production, storage, or preparation for use. Now, Edward very realistically told us that Ireland may have ratified the treaty, which it did, but it's quite possible Shannon Airport is being used in a regular way to transport and possibly nuclear weapons, or possibly parts for the creation of nuclear weapons. But as a note of, I think, optimism, I'd like to take our memories collectively back to Leningrad in 1942. Now it's called St. Petersburg. And let's think about this man, Nikolai Valyvov. And this was a person who, Nikolai Vovilov. This was a person who had dedicated most of his adult life to, as a genetist, as a botanist, as an agronomist, to collecting, hoarding really, the seeds from places all over the world, because as a genetic scientist, he realized that those seeds needed to be stored and kept so that the seed products could continue to be freshened and then spread, so that famine could be prevented. Now, Stalin listened to people who said, no, this guy is he sabotages Russia's or the Soviet agriculture. And they arrested him and they put him in jail. and he died a very terrible death. They basically were starving him. And this man died in 1942. I'm sorry, 1944, before the war had ended. But he had created in Leningrad a very huge and extremely important seed stock institute. And he had 31 colleagues who were helping him to maintain all of these seeds. Well, in the winter of 1942, the Nazis laid siege to Leningrad, and they surrounded the city with tanks. And for 900 days, the city endured artillery fire and bombing. But the worst thing that they endured was starvation. Those who survived ate sawdust and grass and rats. 700,000 people didn't survive. They died of starvation. But at Leningrad's Vavilov Institute, at the research center, the scientists there managed to maintain their metal boxes full of seeds, and even to try to grow new crops so that they could freshen their genetic stock. And I'd like to share with you this photo that shows you how dangerous it was for the people in Leningrad. Right outside of Leningrad were people firing anti-tank missiles. So this made Leningrad a target for even more shelling. But maybe we could just spend a little bit of time looking at some photos from that time. These are residents of Leningrad during shelling. And of course, you can see this man is coping with starvation, and each person had a fourth of a loaf of bread. As a
We're
gift.
not seeing your new picture. If you
Oh.
open,
Okay, let me,
I think you're only sharing PowerPoint.
I see. Okay, I'm so sorry. Let me go back into share screen and see if I can get back to. Anyway, if you get a chance sometime, it might be very interesting for you to go to the website and look up the Vavilov Institute. But as it turned out, there were rats that would even be tipping over the metal boxes full of seeds. And so the scientists rotated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, guarding those seeds. And of them, 9 of them, even though they were surrounded by sacks of potatoes and rice and bags of peanuts, they would not touch those supplies, and 9 of them died of starvation. So I look at scientists like that, and I think of the man who was in charge of the rice stock, and he's reported to us, his name was Dr. Dmitry Ivanov, and before his death, he said, when all the world is in flames of war, we will keep this collection for the future of all people. And that's the kind of courage for peace, not for war, that we so greatly need. And, you know, as has been mentioned now, the United States is moving into Europe, into Belgium and Turkey and Holland and Italy and Germany, more and more nuclear weapon capacity. And recently, you know, there was a review from August 1st to 26th in the UN, and China spoke up. And the Chinese ambassador to the UN said, look, you know, the United States is in violation of the articles of this nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And the ambassador to Germany said, oh, well, those weapons were put in place in Germany before the treaty was actually signed. But wouldn't that be a little bit like somebody who was a slaveholder back in the 16th century saying, or 17th century saying, well, you know, I purchased those slaves before the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, so you can't hold me to that amendment. I think we do have to hold the United States accountable, and we should also try to see the world as it might be seen from the Chinese perspective. In this map, you can see with the US flag, some of them larger, some of them smaller, a representation of these over 750 military bases outside the continental USA. And if you look to see, well, what foreign base does China have? You go to Africa, go to the Horn of Africa, and you see one flag representing the one base that the Chinese have outside their country, and that's in Djibouti. And then look at the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And if you go into the United States map, the United States has nuclear weapons, certainly intercontinental ballistic missile systems across the United States, but also has been, as has been mentioned, in the submarines and in the Air Force capacity. And China is surrounded by Russia's nuclear weapons, the weapons from India, Pakistan, the United States weapons. And yes, China has weapons as well, nuclear weapons. You can see a representation of that. But I think the status quo nuclear weapon bearing powers are willing to say that somehow they can have these weapons because they're enacting deterrence. And it's a ridiculous notion to think that these very criminal policies of maintaining nuclear weapons should ever be referred to as deterrence. So what is the hope of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? I think it's important to at least acknowledge that this treaty, now ratified by 62 countries, does prohibit any undertakings that would develop, test, produce, acquire, possess, stockpile, use, or threaten the use of nuclear weapons. And so if a country that has ratified the treaty enforces it, and Ireland is such an interesting case because they did make it the law of the land. But the question is, will the countries that have ratified actually enforce? But it is a much stronger treaty than what we would have seen prior to this treaty. And the next thing I want to notice is that parliamentarians have signed this pledge. The pledge says that they warmly welcome the entry into force of the UN treaty. They share the deep concern expressed about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and they pledge to work for the ratification of this treaty by their respective countries and to consider the abolition of nuclear weapons to be a global public good of the highest order and an essential step. And so what countries have parliamentarians that have signed this pledge? Well, in the United States, there are people who said that they would sign on to it. This is a list of US representatives. Now, I'm hugely disappointed in the retraction of a letter calling for diplomacy and negotiation with regard to Ukraine. And every single one of these representatives participated in that retraction of what they had previously signed. So that's a big disappointment. And we have a great deal of work to do when people like Ilhan Omar and Jim McGovern and Ro Khanna, who are amongst this group of House of Representatives, people who signed that parliamentarian pledge, when they show themselves to be so spineless in the face of the real war threats that we're facing right now and the nuclear threats. But I also want to acknowledge that if we go back to the scientists, the International Atomic Energy Association has allowed for a team of scientists. There are only 2 there now, but there were 13 scientists previously in Zaporizhia, and they risked their lives because that nuclear plant was being shelled. They might have exposed themselves to nuclear contaminants, but the IAEA has said we will continue to try to demilitarize this area, which is such a dangerous, dangerous area in Ukraine. Again, these are the realists. And right now there is a plan that the World Beyond War is going to release, calling for average ordinary civilians to sign up to be part of a civilian, an unarmed civilian protection force that would basically try to be in support of the scientists who have already journeyed into that Zaporizhia plant, the nuclear plant. And this is a picture of the cars that had formed a convoy to carry the scientists into that plant. Also tomorrow, well, it's tomorrow for all of us. A group of people who are part of what we're calling the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal will go to General Atomics, Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and deliver a subpoena saying that we believe that these corporations should hold themselves accountable and they should come and give account at a 2023 Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal that will be organized over the coming year. It's being launched tomorrow by delivering these subpoenas. And so we invite all of you to be part of this, to try to help promote this idea that it's an outrage, it's a criminal, unlawful outrage to continue to develop nuclear weapons, and these must be stigmatized, and we must call upon our universities. For those of you in the Chicago area, the University of Illinois is collaborating with the Sandia National Laboratories, and they're receiving money to help create the non-nuclear weapon parts that are used in nuclear weapon manufacture. And also they're helping create simulations of nuclear weapon testing. Since the test ban has been put in place, they're doing simulations to sort of go underneath that idea.
Kathy, can you wrap up your talk?
Thank you. Yeah, I just would like to wrap it up by saying thank you for paying attention to these issues, and I certainly look forward to all of your questions. Thank you.
All right. Oh, who has questions or comments? Kathy, I would like to, my own question, I would like to hear more about what ordinary people can do who cannot travel to Washington, D.C. to deliver, or wherever, to deliver these subpoenas. Is there some way we could support that endeavor?
Well, we are very much in need of people who would assist with research, so that we're developing a list of the places where we believe crimes against humanity happened and were aided and abetted by these corporations. But as we isolate certain cases and then look for people to interview in Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and Gaza, we need to be able to connect those situations with the actual weapons that were used, and that takes ongoing research. So anybody who'd like to be involved in that would be very, very welcome. Also, in the course of the year, we'll be having webinars similar to what you've organized, Mary, so that we would welcome people to develop webinars when we actually have the tribunal, to be engaged in watch parties. We are going to need to raise some money for this, and so by promoting it and talking about it, that's also helpful as well. We have a website, merchantsofdeath.org, and that's kind of a fledgling website right now, but we are beginning to do the interviews that we'll need. We just interviewed Cornel West, and it was a wonderful interview, and we'll be interviewing people who are survivors of these various attacks.
Can you put the link to that website in the chat? And Edward, can you tell us the work what kind of work does Shannon Watch do?
Yes, it's one of a number of NGOs in Ireland, and in particular we work at Shannon Airport, tracking the US military aircrafts that are going through the airport, publicizing them on Facebook and on various websites. But our main objective is to promote Irish neutrality and to try and hold the government in Ireland to account for breaches of Irish neutrality, which at the moment we feel has almost been ended, even though the vast majority of the Irish people, over 75%, are very strongly supportive of Irish neutrality. And we're very concerned that in the past, Ireland has done tremendous work with the United Nations peacekeeping, since the mid 1950s. Now we are partly involved with NATO and European Union Army, so it's quite an important issue in Ireland at the moment. But I'm also involved with Veterans for Peace and with an organisation called the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, and with a number of international peace organisations also. I think the importance of internationalising the peace movement, particularly for a small country like Ireland, has to be emphasised. So the more we can become involved with organisations like World Beyond War, World Peace Council, the better.
Who else has a question or a comment?
I would like to ask a question. My name is Cheryl Brimbach Keyford. Thank you all very much for your presentations. Really appreciate it. So I'm curious about. I know the U.S. does deploy weapons in Europe, in those 5 countries where they station the short range nuclear weapons. Are there other places around the world besides? So the map we saw showed the number of weapons that are owned by the different countries, but are there other places around the world where nuclear weapons are stationed by other countries or the US? As well as, I know they're across the globe in terms of where they are in submarines and probably other naval vessels, but other land-based nuclear weapons that are outside of those countries that quote own them?
As far as I know, in Australia, there are nuclear weapons, and at the moment there is an agreement between Australia, the US, and Britain to increase the involvement of that group of countries, partly in order to target China in the Pacific. So that's a specific problem, and there are plans to. Australia has agreed to buy a very expensive nuclear-powered submarine, which will be capable of carrying nuclear weapons. So that's just one example.
I think another example is Israel. Israel will not acknowledge that it possesses nuclear weapons, but even the CIA says they have at least 80 thermonuclear warheads, probably a good deal more. But the United States has always protected Israel from any kind of investigation by the International Atomic Energy Association. And I think there's been a great deal of sharing of technology with Israel as well. So would you say that Israel is helping the United States foreign policy in the region? You know, we don't know whether the tail is wagging the dog sometimes, but I think that, you know, other countries have said they want a nuclear-free Middle East, and Israel says, well, we won't be the first to introduce weapons into the region. Bob?
Israel, they have not signed an NPT. They do not deny or confirm that they have warheads, and they say they will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons. But you have to define, what do you mean introduce? Bringing them out, showing them, or using them? And yes, Israel got all kinds of assistance from the US. There was a lot of uranium that disappeared from the United States and wound up in Israel to kickstart their nuclear program. And South Africa was involved with the Israelis. And I look at it that make the Mideast nuclear free, just like Australia and other parts of the world. And the question I ask people who are proponents of nuking Iran is if Israel did not have nuclear weapons, there would not be a reason for anybody else to have them for the deterrent effect.
Yeah, I actually worked in the Sinai Desert in 1973-74 as a UN peacekeeper. And at one stage, there was a real fear that Israel was starting to lose the war in the Sinai. And at one stage, the UN forces in the Sinai were told to double or triple their cover and to dig down into the sand, because there was a fear that Israel, if it was losing the war in the Sinai, would actually use nuclear weapons as early as 73, 74. So it's the reality is that if push came to shove, I've little doubt Israel would use them.
And Cheryl, also, Saudi Arabia is constantly trying to get more materials to develop nuclear technology. They say for nuclear energy, but that's a path somewhat similar to what we've seen in Iran. And the United States has green-lighted Saudi development of nuclear technology without the Saudis ever being subjected to any inspections by the International Atomic Energy Association. So it does seem like the proliferation could be spurred on, and there are plenty of conflicts all over the world, which makes it, I mean, it's small wonder that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says that we're less than a minute before doomsday, with the readiness of all these countries to sometimes be itching to use the triggers for what they have.
It's not so much can you build a nuclear weapon, but do you have access to the fissile material? And like people who worry about China, that there are in another 3 years, people are saying they will have 1,000 warheads. The reality is China does not have that much fissile material and would not have that much to build that many. So why are people worrying about it? It's that saber rattling. And you know, why is there missile defense? Who is the missile defense here in the United States? Who is that aimed at? China. So
I have a question, and my question is, war just is causing havoc to the planet. The military, what the military, the emissions and everything, it has increased all of the climate problems. Is there a lot of effort to publicizing that, to try to get people to realize that we better do something to stop war if we want to save the planet?
I would say it's maybe just the opposite. There's a lot of effort by the governments and by the military to deny that they are a problem. And yes, there is a huge need to expose the dangers of militarism, and not enough is happening. The military, particularly the US military, are by far one of the greatest polluters, and yeah, so, and the biggest one of the biggest contributors to global warming.
Yeah.
Ah,
I admired some of the, I'm sorry, some of the countries that Sharm el-Sheikh, who are trying to deal with climate catastrophe, and they, you know, made it very, very clear that those are the countries that are the most impoverished, the most undeveloped, as you might say, are the least responsible for those emissions that are causing so much contamination. And yet there's no question of reparations being paid to them by the wealthier countries that have created what is predominantly affecting them the worst, the poorer countries, in terms of severe weather events. And so again, I think about, you know, how unprepared we are to cope with wave after wave of refugees that will be needing to run away, not only from wars, but from starvation, because they won't be able to feed their livestock or plant their crops or have enough water to live on. And yet we stigmatize the refugees. We should be stigmatizing these criminals that are running to the bank with their portfolios stuffed, manufacturing more and more weapons. Who are the criminals? Who really threatens life on the planet?
In fact, at the moment, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco are being paid huge amounts of money by the European Union to prevent refugees from Africa crossing the Mediterranean, and are doing so involving huge human rights abuses, particularly in Libya, but also in Egypt. So while on the one hand, Egypt is hosting the COP22, it is also grossly abusing the human rights of people who are trying to move through Egypt across the Mediterranean.
To persuade the nuclear armed countries to eliminate some of their nuclear weapons and their stockpiles, aren't we going to have to persuade 2 or more countries to do it together? Countries that see each other as adversaries. If the United States and China could agree to begin, both of them, each of them, to eliminate numbers of these stockpiles of weapons, and then if Russia could be persuaded to begin to eliminate them, they might be less terrified if they knew their adversaries were at the same time eliminating them.
But look at what happened in Libya. Would you eliminate, as long as the US has these weapons, would you eliminate your nuclear weapons? And then you've got Korea, which is going to be, people are going to say, yes, we could eliminate them, but what about Korea? They're going to, North Korea, not just Korea, North Korea. I think it's pie in the sky, to be honest.
Roger has a question. Turn your mic on, Roger.
Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, let me unmute myself. I remember as late as the early 1980s, there was a very, very vibrant, strong anti-nuclear war movement, especially in Europe. And they were capable of bringing thousands and thousands of protesters into the streets. First of all, this is a question I'm directing to all 3 speakers. What happened to that movement? Why isn't there that movement today? And second, is there any prospect of reviving movements like that? Because to me, the only viable solution, if there is a solution at all, is going to have to be millions of people seeing the danger and putting down their tools of work, a kind of worldwide general strike. I know that's utopian and probably not anywhere near in the cards. If they can't do it for climate change, how would we expect them to do it for this threat? But what happened to the movement, and what happened to the anti-nuclear movement, and what are the prospects of generating a huge new movement?
Well, the best way to generate interest in it is for somebody to detonate the nuclear bomb. And then you get people very interested. The fact that I belong to many peace groups or anti-nuke groups, CDN campaign in the UK, Wales. And I have to say that in Europe, there is more activity anti-nuclear than there is here in the United States. And I really think it's a shame. But the fact is, those of us are dying. And I go to meetings and I look around and I see all these gray-haired hippies. And I say, where are the young people? Who are we going to pass the baton to? They're not there. They're not interested. They're not concerned about it. A few years ago in Hawaii, was it 3 years ago, something, the sirens went off on Oahu or on Hawaii, all the islands, saying that they were under a missile attack. Somebody pushed the wrong button in the command post. And so for over 30 minutes, the sirens were going, the messages were going out saying, we are under attack, missile attack. And people panicked. They went to a frenzy. Oh my God, the world is ending. And then when it was determined that, this was a big mistake, really sorry, go back to your day. That's what people did. They went back to their normal materialistic life, shallow life, and stopped worrying about nuclear weapons.
Well, I'd like to just underscore, though, what Roger said about a general strike. I think that, young people today are organizing. They're organizing unions. We've seen some strikes on the rise. Greta Thunberg has certainly done her share. And it's not true that the young people don't care. I don't know. I do probably 3 or 4 Zoom presentations a week during times when schools are in session, and the students are going, yeah. They get it. And I think they do care. Certainly climate catastrophe is a number one issue because of what they're inheriting from us. But I think it's possible that young people would reach a point where they would say, we can't afford your policies any longer. And we should promote the idea of general strike. I'm hoping that this Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal will end up with recommendations, one of which would be a general strike. So I wouldn't give up on that possibility. I mean, I myself was so influenced by, Roger, what you mentioned in the 80s. I landed myself in prison for planting corn on nuclear missile silo sites and became a war tax refuser and never paid a dime of money to the US government again. So it's not impossible, but we really do have to give it everything we've got.
Yeah, I would say that in Europe right now, we're up against a wave of propaganda in favor of war and in favor of militarism, which has been unprecedented. I think even Joseph Goebbels, would be amazed at the success of the propaganda. Even in Ireland, a neutral country, our national broadcasting are continually telling us what's happening in Ukraine, almost exclusively pro-Ukrainian, ignoring that there are 2 sides in this war, and totally against any peace movement. So that's a huge issue that needs to be addressed. We need to have our own genuine peace propaganda to counter that. With regards to the protests, in 2003, there were huge protests against the Iraq war before the war happened. In Dublin in particular, we had 100,000 people on the streets of Dublin. I happened to be in London at the same time, and I marched with 3 million people in London against the war just before the war started. As soon as the war started, regardless of what the people felt, all these crowds disappeared, and most of them have not rejoined the peace movement in the meantime. It was the frustration and the disenchantment at the government's refusing to obey the will of the people. So there is that. But in the meantime, the propaganda being raised right across Europe, pro-war, pro-militarism, and against peace is quite amazing.
Vince has his hand up. Go ahead, Vince.
Yes, just a couple of things. One is I scanned the images of all of us. I mean, not scanned to save them. I've just looked over the images of all of us. And unfortunately, we all fit the pattern that we are older people who most likely were influenced in our anti-war opinions by the war in Vietnam. That's most likely. And, you know, we went on from there. The younger people who have not faced the prospect of being told you must participate directly in war, and now with the drones and the ability to participate in war at no risk to yourself more than your neighbor down the street, I mean, it's a different situation. And not having faced that, the young people are not as, even though they grew up under the threat of nuclear, they probably didn't grow up under the duck and cover drills that we grew up under in the 50s. Probably not. And then Vietnam. And I don't know, if you haven't had that experience, it doesn't carry the urgency, is what I'm fearing. And look around. Where are they? They're not here. They're not in this webinar tonight. So that's a concern of mine. So we need to start reaching out, and we need to find the vehicle that will reach out. And unfortunately, we did not find that vehicle tonight for the younger people, unless they watch the YouTube version later. Thank you.
But just because they're not in our extended networks doesn't mean they don't have networks of their own.
Yeah.
I mean, and Kathy is telling us she speaks on Zoom meetings at schools, and that the young people are very responsive. So, you know, we are in our own silo here.
Well, and also they're saying that it was the young people that saved a number of seats for the Democrats the midterms. In Wisconsin, the numbers of young people, it was like compared to the 2020 election versus now, it was like an increase of over 300% of the young people voting. So, I mean, they're not apathetic when something involves them. You just have to figure out how to get them involved in nuclear.
I think the climate crisis is becoming more and more visible to people. But I think that nuclear catastrophe is far more abstract, even to those of us who are here tonight. It's much more of an abstraction.
Could I ask a related question? So if we were to think about worst case scenarios, beyond like the complete destruction, annihilation of the earth, what would be the likelihood of the next nuclear incident using a weapon? So in my mind, it would likely be somewhere in Africa, like the DR Congo, where the US has secretly, or someone else secretly placed small quote tactical nuclear weapons, and they get used somehow. That would be what would come to my mind. I personally doubt like a big strike from the US to Russia or vice versa, or even China on someone else. But I would like to hear those who know much more than I do about this.
I don't know much more. I was going to suggest an old nuclear plant melting down or having an accident and then
No,
the
no, I was thinking of like intentional use of a nuclear weapon.
You're saying more terrorist use of nuclear weapon.
No, not terrorists, like one of the known nuclear weapons, like a known nuclear power having some involvement in the next use of a nuclear weapon. What's the likelihood? Where and how would that happen?
I would say this, India, Pakistan would, in my view, be fairly the most likely. This Pakistan has never been a democracy, except for very short periods, and there is still a huge problem in Kashmir between India and Pakistan, and there's now quite a right-wing government in India as well. So, and both of them have somewhere in the region of 100, 200 nuclear bombs each. And again, on the basis of calling each other's bluff, if there were to be another war between India and Pakistan, one or the other probably would go for first use of nuclear weapons. So that's one of the more dangerous ones, as I would see, rather than America, China, or America versus Russia. The other one, I think, would be Israel. That if Israel was severely threatened by anybody, I have little doubt that they would very quickly use nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I think a related threat is that the Chinese say that they're developing a drone that's capable of carrying a tactical nuclear weapon. And so, that the drones have already been the poor people's weapon that gives them a little bit more capacity to deliver a blow to people that are many, many, many times more wealthy than they are and have much huger arsenals. But the idea of a drone being able to deliver a tactical nuclear weapon is quite frightening.
Yes. Roger.
Yeah, I'm thinking about something Bob said just a couple of minutes ago, and that's shocking to me. And but it seems to be part of the paralysis that I feel, and that I think many of us feel about this issue. He said, the only way you're going to get attention drawn to this, and outrage and fear, that is, that gets some traction, some where the tire hits the road and something happens, something that can be done legislatively across the world to, eliminate these weapons and the possibility of their use, is if an actual disaster happens, either inadvertently or, where it's actually intended, and whether it's a terrorist use or whatnot. And that would get the attention of the media. And there would be no denying the suffering and harm that it did, and it would get, it would get massive attention. And it's only that would bring what Mary called the abstract nature of this down to earth and down to our reality. It's the very nightmarish event that kind of makes us all Bob also talked about Hawaii. I remember that people went back to their normal lives, but our normal lives have this at the fringe, have this danger and this threat. It's part of our lives, and to try to live a normal life with that with that threat at the fringe of extinction of our families. Just anecdotally, sometimes I think when my wife goes to Chicago, say, the thought crosses my mind. I live in suburban, Chicago. And I bet this happens to all of us, and I bet it happens to every young person. But you know, the thought occurs to me that if there were a nuclear detonation, I'd never see my wife again, nor would I see all my friends in Chicago. They'd all be gone. Now that thought only occurs briefly and it's gone. It's like a nightmare or the kind of threat that I can't entertain that kind of thought for very long because it's just too painful. So what do we do with that kind of threat that is so painful to think about, and yet it's absolutely necessary to entertain that and keep our mind on it, keep ourselves focused on this danger?
Well, wouldn't you think that all the pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be enough to scare people?
Well, let me jump in here because I was going to say something. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that a lot of the information and imagery was made public.
That's right.
After the bombing, anything dealing with radiation, what people were dealing with, this was all kept away from the American people. The people that were building these damn things did not want people knowing the horror of these things. And during atmospheric testing, downwinders got irradiated and died, sheep, cattle. It was no big deal. You know, it's, oh, not a problem, not a problem. But here we are, and yes, it is a problem. People need to be educated. I get thrown off of Facebook once a year, sometimes more, because I will post an image from Nagasaki, a woman with her baby, nursing her baby, and both have burns and cuts. And Facebook says that violates their community standards. It's the same thing. Why don't we show pictures of what war is like? Show burned, blown up bodies. Show the GIs. But no, we don't do that. It might upset somebody's sensibilities. Excuse me?
Yeah.
But, you know, you look back, somebody was talking earlier about the money involved. Smedley Butler, he was a Marine Corps general back in the day. And he wrote a book, War is a Racket. And basis, this was in the 30s, that he was raising the reality that you had industry that was making lots of money off of war. And we have Dwight D. Eisenhower, his farewell speech, where he warned about the military-industrial complex. And I submit that we still have that today. They make a lot of money on war.
So that sounds like what we should focus on here. I'm concerned about time. We're way over time. This is a marvelous discussion, but holding the weapons makers accountable it's like the most productive avenue here.
And that's what Kathy is working on with that Merchants of Death, correct?
That's right. And also locally, there's a wonderful Code Pink person, Shay LaBelle. And Shay is working to focus on Boeing and domestic in Boeing. So it'd be great to be supportive of that.
Yes, there is our moves on to go after the people that are making the money. And colleges are taking the money that they invest out of these banks or corporations because of their role in war, that they won't support it.
So Kathy, where can we learn a little more about this tribunal you're planning?
Oh, thank you. I put it in the chat, but I'll just enter it in again. That's the website. And right now we have in supportive roles, John Pilger, Noam Chomsky, Medea Benjamin, Mairead Maguire, Cornel West, Jammu Baraka. And then there are 3 well-known lawyers, Bill Quigley, Marjorie Cohn, and Ann Wright, who meet with us every month to help begin to plan out, for instance, the kinds of subpoenas that'll be served tomorrow, and how we can develop this as an international campaign. It'll all be aired online November 10th, and then we'll take off the 11th, and then on the 12th and the 13th of 2023. So there's a year to plan this. And we would love to have people being kind of in watch gatherings all around the world as well, and to involve university people as much as possible.
Are all of these centered in the United States, or are there other companies doing the same in other countries?
Well, these 4 companies are certainly transnational in the sense that they do a lot of business around the world. But their headquarters are actually all now in either Arlington, Virginia, or Washington, D.C. They might as well just move into the White House. They exercise so much corporate control over governance in this country. And then they make so much money, they have enough money to hire legions of lobbyists, and then they can bully the people on Capitol Hill even more, saying support what we want to do. So it's you're right, Bob. Dwight Eisenhower nailed it. Beware the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial congressional complex.
You know, I work for a U.S. congressman, and I left because of much of what I saw and up in Washington and in the basement of Jim's house, you know. But yeah, it was money. Money makes the world go around. And we look at the campaign this year, we haven't gotten the total of what that cost, how much money was wasted.
God.
Campaigning, message and media. That's what one of the first lessons I learned working for Jim Marshall. You had to have a message, and you had to have the money to pay for the media. And it's sad.
Yeah.
Kathy, if you could send me regular information about the tribunal, I will pass it along
Great. I
to
will certainly do that.
this group of people. I see that Edward has left us. He says it's way past his bedtime in Ireland.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And
So
sitting
long, guys.
us.
And Bob, thank you so much for responding to my letter.
No problem at all. You know, I enjoy doing this stuff, and either publicly or online, as long as I can show my pictures and tell
Well, I
my
was totally
story.
overwhelmed with your book,
Oh,
or whatever you want to call it. I thought it was tremendous.
well, duck and
How long
cover.
did how long did it take you to compile all of that information?
It was about a 4-year process
Okay.
of researching it, because at the time there wasn't a lot of information available for researching publicly. But yeah, about 4 years. And that's what got me into this business of being anti-nuclear, was duck and cover as a kid, because I remember it over here at middle school. I remember duck and cover, and I remember the Korean or the Cuban Missile thing. Scared the bejubies out of this, 9-10-year-old kid, to had not an understanding that, what, we're going to war and what's this duck and cover stuff.
I don't remember duck and cover, but I certainly remember the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, yes.
I don't think in Strawberry Point, Iowa, we ducked and covered, to be honest with you.
So, Nina, may I keep you on my list and send you more information?
Yes, please do.
Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for being invited.
All right. Thank you, Bob and Kathy, for your presentations. They were excellent.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Great to be with all of you, and thank you, Bob.
All right. Bye, Kathy.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
all.
Mary. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.